Let's start the second part of our interview with Andréanne Bissonnette. We will discover the relations between gender studies and border studies in the North American case study. And my first question, Andréanne, is this one. Can you give us a brief overview of the general characteristics of the North American region for the study of border and gender studies, please?
Yes. This is a hard one. So your question is broad, but at the same time, I think it's hard to offer a quick or succinct response because, as I've many other scholars before me discussed, there is not one US-Mexico border region nor one Canada-US border region. So it's hard to pinpoint general characteristics of North American border region when it comes to the study of border and gender studies. However, if I want to identify broad dynamics that may be at play along both U.S. border in relation to border and gender studies, I think I would highlight four. So the first one is that both borders are regularly crossed by individuals. So whether you're talking about daily cross-border workers, students, day travelers, migrants, regular and irregular crossings, both of those borders are regularly crossed. And as I mentioned in the first part of our discussion, immigration policies and border policies may contribute to reinforcing certain stereotypes or be biased, which in turn will influence and impact women and LGBTQ plus individuals' experiences of borders. So that happens along both borders. And regardless of the purpose of your trip, regardless of whether it's a regular or irregular crossing, those policies will come and be at play. The second element is that relating to border crossing and the border processes and surveillance, but from a more macro level, right? At both borders, there are mechanisms and policies in place that the aim of which are to exclude. So while various systemic oppressions converge at borders, dynamics that can be analyzed through intersectionality and queer theories are present at both borders because you have those mechanisms and those policies whose aim is to exclude. And so from a gender studies perspective, those mechanisms and their impact and how they are reinforced or produce or reproduce those inequities and those systemic oppressions can be analyzed through intersectionality and queer theories. And thirdly, along both the Canada-US and the Mexico-US borders, we find multiple transnational feminist networks in areas that are very broad. So we have in immigration, in health, in labor, in environment, and they will have an impact for the study of border and gender studies. And lastly, for the theory of borders, the North American borders are interesting because they are very different in terms of how visible they are in daily life and the level of surveillance and control at each border. And also you'll have along both borders variation depending on where you are along each border. So when you pair that with gender studies, the different physicality of each border or each sub-border region and the varying various immaterial manifestation of borders too can lead to specific understanding of how women, trans, non-binary, LGBTQ plus individuals will experience borders, whether at the international line or through its less visible manifestations, whether, as we talked earlier, whether it's through immigration control in spaces such as healthcare or whether it's through checkpoints or elsewhere where immigration and border policies may apply.
Thank you, Andréanne, for this clear overview. In one of your last articles, The Intimate is International Reproductive Health Dynamics in the Texas-Mexico Borderlands, an article that you have published in the Routledge Companion to Gender and Borderlands in 2024. You argue that borderlands are neither fully national nor international. Policies on one side can impact women on both sides. Can you explain a little bit this argument, please?
Yes. So if you've lived in a border region before, this might be very familiar to you. But if you haven't, let me share a story real quick. So I worked on reproductive health access in border region, right? So both international travels as well as internal travels to access reproductive health care. And so through my work, I lived in El Paso, Texas, which is right on the border with Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. And I've traveled through the years across the US-Mexico border in various sister cities that we called. And these towns are right on the border. So on either side of the border. When I was in El Paso, you could see the street of Juarez from the university campus. And before the reversal of Roe v. Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court and the Texas law prohibiting abortion, I visited an abortion clinic in McAllen, Texas. And this was the sole provider, so the only clinic for all women in the Rio Grande Valley, but also for women on the Mexican side of the border. And so when women had financial means and the ability to travel internationally, they would cross the border into Texas and obtain care at that clinic. And conversely, you would have women from the US that would travel to Mexico to access contraception at a cheaper price. And some form of contraception was available over the counter, so without having to have a doctor's appointment and a prescription. So when the state of Texas implemented its SB 8 law prohibiting abortion after 6 weeks, Texans lost their access to care, right? But Mexican women in border states also lost their access to care because they could no longer access care in Texas right on the other side of the border. So this law that was implemented by the U.S. meant to restrict U.S. residents' access to reproductive health care also ultimately impacted women on both sides of the border, as access to care, not just reproductive health care, but general health care in many border communities is a cross-border affair. So you may have your reproductive health care provider on one side, your dentist on the other side, your general care on one side, your specialist on the other side. And so any small change on either side of the border will have an impact on residents of both sides of the border. And since that chapter has been published, it's quite interesting because we have seen the opposite. Now that abortion is legal in Mexico, we have clinics in Tijuana, for example, that are getting more calls by Americans who want to travel to the other side of the border. So the border becomes this place where it's not fully international, it's not fully national, and you have policies on both sides that have impact beyond their border and these networks of care that are being impacted.
Thank you, Andréanne, for this precision, for this case study. Reproductive rights differ significantly between the US and Mexico, as you have just said. But what are the reproductive rights policies on each side of the US-Mexico border that have harmful consequences for the people?
Yeah. So on the Mexican side, there are not really harmful consequences from reproductive right policies because since September 2023, abortion has been decriminalized at the federal level. So in terms of access to contraception, as I've mentioned, it's for some types of contraception, it's over the counter. Abortion access is decriminalized. And health in Mexico is a right in the Mexican Constitution. So on that front, there's very little harm caused by reproductive health policies. However, that is not to say that it's readily available and without any obstacles to access to care. But I would say that on the Mexican side, the policies at the state level that kind of still restrict where clinics could open, are the most harmful policies, as well as the general perception of abortion that is still anchored in a religious background. So the right or wrong aspect of reproductive health and the gender role and beliefs about family are dynamics that may impact individuals' access to reproductive health care, but not the availability necessarily of care. In the US, however, since the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and more so since January 20th, where we have now a Republican at the White House and a Republican-controlled Congress, there are more harmful policies that have been enacted. And across the United States, we have a patchwork of laws, not only on abortion access, but on all matter of reproductive health access. So maternal care, access to OBGYN, access to contraception, STI testing, all of that is regulated state by state. And so you have some states that are more permissive, like California or New Mexico along the border, Washington State up north. And you have some more restrictive states like Texas or North Dakota that have more harmful policies in place that will impact primarily women in the United States. But as I mentioned, for those who were used to having those cross-border networks of care, may have impacts as well on the other side of the border.
Thank you, Andréanne. My following question concerns the political context today, the new political context, and it explores the impact of a new U.S. administration's policies on border management. What will be the main challenges with the new American presidency during the next 4 years for each of the two borders, US-Mexico and US-Canada? I'm thinking, for example, of the reinforcement of walls, barriers, and the effects of security policies.
Yeah, that is, as you said, a lot of change have already happened. When we are recording this podcast, we are 11 days into the new administration. And already changes have been made. And along the US-Mexico border, the challenges will be significant and have been significant for the past 11 days. The first challenge is the reinstitution of Remain in Mexico. So that was a policy that was in place during the first Trump administration that basically said that asylum seekers have to wait in Mexico for their asylum case to be treated in the United States, and they won't be granted entry unless their file has been completely revised. And as we've seen, while Remain in Mexico was in place, it created significant challenges along the US-Mexico border because you have people that are arriving at the border in areas where basically people who are profiting from that are smugglers and criminal organization, right? So you increase the vulnerability of migrants and the risk associated with immigration with the reinstatement of the Remain in Mexico. There has also been the abrupt end of CBP-1, which was an appointment program that managed the asylum seekers' appointment in the United States. So it basically left about 300,000 people scrambling to know what comes next, if they will get a day in court, if their case will move forward or not. So a lot of uncertainty as well. And there has been also the National Emergency Declaration at the border, which opens the door to the U.S. Army being deployed at the border, increased National Guard presence at the border as well, and the continuation of the U.S.-Mexico border wall as well. So all that being said, I think undoubtedly we will see human suffering, tensions, distress from individuals who are already vulnerable. And it's still to be determined how deportation will also play into that. So we know that the Mexican government has been actively planning for that. They have been building shelters in certain border towns, including in Ciudad Juarez. And we've seen yesterday the first ICE raid in El Paso, which is on the other side of the border. So how that will play into it is to be seen. But a lot of uncertainty along the US-Mexico border. And to bring in the gender perspective, another significant element is the executive order ending specific treatment of transgender individuals in detention, including immigration detention, and the new administration guidelines on gender, which will both have a direct impact at the border and for migrant and federal immigration detention, and how asylum case may be treated moving forward in the U.S. immigration system. That will have an impact on both borders, but most importantly along the U.S.-Mexico border, where you have most migrants coming in. And not related to gender studies, but still I think it's important to mention on the question of the wall. As was the case during the first Trump term, we can expect environmental challenges and impacts, and also impacts for indigenous communities along the U.S.-Mexico border, whose native lands are cross-border lands as well. Along the Canada-U.S. border, that's an interesting question, because usually when there are changes in the U.S. or when we're talking about border management in the U.S., it's mostly focused on the U.S.-Mexico border. But we've seen with Trump, with this new administration, a clear focus on both U.S. borders. And with the Canada-U.S. border, we've already seen changes to how Canada is addressing border security issues. So in the past few months, trying to appease Trump and kind of try to not have the tariffs imposed on Canada, the Canadian government has been taking steps to increase surveillance along the US-Canada border, whether through the implementation of drones, as well as leasing 2 Black Hawks helicopters to patrol the US-Canada border. So we're seeing those changes. And aside from securing the border, one thing that I'll mention is that Canada may also have to respond to increase migration flow at its border with the US, depending on how the deportation plan is implemented and which populations are targeted. So, for example, during the US presidential election campaign, Trump heavily focused on Asian migrants residing in Springfield, Ohio, on multiple occasions, whether himself or his VP have talked about this issue, and he has vowed to end their temporary protected status. So we know from the last time that Trump was in office that that is a group that could potentially try to move to Canada should the threat be real, because of the ties between Asian communities in the United States and Asian communities in Canada, particularly in Quebec. So that is something that is also to be taken into consideration from the Canadian perspective. And when thinking more specifically in terms of gender and borders at the Canada-US borders, I'll mention 2 things quickly: reproductive health access and LGBTQ plus migrants. The first thing is that with the US no longer recognizing gender diversity, Canada should be mindful of how that could influence also migration at the Canada-US border. So will it lead to people who would have wanted to present an asylum claim in the United States trying to present one in Canada instead, because there are more protection for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and migrants in Canada as opposed to what exists now in the United States? And the second element, I'm currently finishing a paper on cross-border travel for reproductive health care at the Canada-US border. And while there hasn't been an increase in cross-border travel for abortion care since the reversal of Roe v. Wade, most patients were traveling to states protecting abortion care. If further restrictions are implemented at the federal level regarding abortion access and restrictions in the United States, Canada may become a destination for Americans looking to terminate a pregnancy, and that could have an impact on cross-border movements as well.
Thank you, Andréanne. Borderlands are very paradoxical. Huh? They are often far from the centers of powers. They are a tool of powers. They are a space of powers, but they can also generate some innovative solutions to local and global challenges. And Andréanne, do you know some useful or accurate local initiatives in the borderlands to overcome all these challenges created by the borders and the borderlands policies?
Yeah, I really like this question. So indeed, borderlands are oftentimes an afterthought for government who are often situated far from the borders. And especially life in the borderlands. And at the Border Policy Research Institute, we're currently working on a project how communities were impacted by the travel measures put in place during COVID-19 in collaboration with the Simon Fraser University, right? And through focus groups that I've conducted in communities along both the Canada-US border on both sides, some of those initiatives came through. And like, for example, the case of Point Roberts, whom you may be familiar with on the West Coast, and how the community came together and tried to figure out how can we have solutions that work for our community and for the specificity of Point Roberts as well. So I think that through the years, borderlanders have developed many local initiatives to respond to local problems and to adapt to a lack of policy making at the federal level, especially when it comes to day-to-day life, right? So the governments will think about the border in terms of securing the border and the border policies, but not necessarily how life is lived in the borderlands. And that's where I think local innovations and adaptable forms of governments, as you mentioned, really come to shine. And that's whether we're talking about economy, environment, health, culture. I think borderlanders along both the US-Canada and US-Mexico border have been at the forefront of many local initiatives. But it really comes down to a top-down or bottom-up approach. And in this case, the bottom-up approach prevailed in multiple instances. So I've seen, for example, I work specifically on health and borders. So I've seen the creation of cross-border network of care along both borders, resilience and adaptation when services or goods were unavailable, communities coming together during COVID-19 to mediatize the situation and to really bring attention to the fact that cross-border communities oftentimes will rely on one another or may have one grocery store for both communities or one cultural center for both communities. And so I think that those networks exist. Some of them are very visible. Some of them are less visible. So, for example, abortion access, some of those networks exist only on WhatsApp or on word of mouth. You have to know where to go and that type of thing. Others are very well advertised. And so when it comes to healthcare, that has allowed for people to, for example, if something is too expensive in the United States, well, I could go to Mexico or I could go to Canada to get the care that I need that my insurance won't cover or that I don't have the financial means to. But there are still some obstacles to that and limits to border communities' ability to implement those local initiatives because they remain dependent on federal government's decisions regarding borders, for one, and also on an individual standpoint, they are dependent on the fact of whether or not they have a passport and the ability to cross borders, which not all people do. And if you have a legal status versus non-legal status, then that will impact your ability to rely on those cross-border networks and some of those initiatives as well. So while there is a lot of innovations in border communities, and that is something that I think is very rich and very special about border communities, their ability to put those solutions in place are curbed to some extent by the fact that the central government still makes border policies and they can decide whether or not movement is facilitated or limited. And that's one of the problems. And for listeners, if I may do a little bit of self-promotion for the Border Policy Research Institute, If listeners want to visit our website and look at the publications specifically on Cascadia, but also we've done some story maps, so interactive tools where people can see and hear more about local initiatives during COVID, and also for sports and music and all sorts of things. So I highly recommend visiting our website.
Thank you, Andréanne. Yes, our friends from Bellingham and US are very close to us, and we are happy to work with them. Academic research projects, such as those led by feminist scholars in border studies, gender studies, migration studies, often document the gaps in policies and also the dangers of these policies. And they provide evidence-based recommendations for change. My question is this one, Andréanne. Can you give us an example of an initiative or research project that has helped concretely to overcome gender injustices in border areas?
Yeah, I would love to give out multiple examples of initiatives or research that allowed us to overcome gender injustices. But unfortunately, I don't think that there is a border area where gender injustices have been completely eradicated, because that would require significant sociopolitical changes that are not limited to border areas. And border-specific dynamics may contribute to gender injustices, but they are also not different from other geographical areas in the sense that systems of oppressions, including gender oppressions, exist everywhere, not just along borders. But with that being said, I do want to take the opportunity to mention the work of one of my mentors, Dr. Eva Moya at the University of Texas at El Paso. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Moya during my research stay at UTEP. And I think that the work that she does is truly phenomenal, both in research spaces and in the community. And that's why I wanted to mention her work here, because it touches both on initiatives and research kind of at the same time. And through the years, she implemented multiple initiatives, including research action technique, as well as working on collaborative projects with what we call Promotoras de Salud. So kind of peer-to-peer awareness campaign to go into the communities and try to get people to have access to healthcare and to raise awareness about specific health issues. And her project specifically was aimed to raise awareness about HPV vaccines among Latinas who have a lower vaccination rate than other communities. And so to get a better access to healthcare and to bring down those disparities in terms of access to healthcare in the borderlands, regardless of immigration status. And she also led multiple initiatives for the home-free population in El Paso, many of which are migrants and migrant women. And through those initiatives at a local scale, kind of working to deconstruct and to eliminate those gender injustices, and those injustices also lived by migrants. So that's one example. That's one very local example. But I think that these types of initiatives where you bring together research and concrete initiatives that have a clear community impact are extremely relevant and important, because it's not only tackling specific issues in one border region, but through the research, it also raises awareness and bring light to specific challenges while being great opportunities for specific borderlands. So you're kind of doing the local work, but also while publishing on the subject, you're kind of bringing this issue on a more macro level, and other people can be inspired and apply it to their local context as well.
Related to your last answer, while not border specific, the Global Gender Gap Report addresses gender equality in various countries. But is there a global scientific index that assesses the most egalitarian or inclusive borders or borders areas in the world, Andréanne?
That is very interesting. To my knowledge, there is not one that focuses solely on border areas. If I'm wrong, please correct me. If not, if we have students listening, that would be so interesting for a PhD project to delve into specifically borders and equity. And I would love to see that come to fruition.
Thank you, Andrea. The Association for Borderlands Studies will meet in Seattle in April 2025 for its annual conference on governing across borders, reimagining people, place, and policy. And one of the panels will focus on innovative ways to support academic research. What can, example, podcasts and interactive multimedia do for border and gender studies research in general, Andrea? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought it up. So as part of the ABS conference in Seattle, my colleague Jennifer Bettis and I at the Border Policy Research Institute were organizing a roundtable to discuss knowledge translation and how we can better communicate about our research. And as I was saying, one of the issues is that we're doing research, but it doesn't get in the hands of those that it should get in the hands of, to have changes about the policies or to raise awareness about those types of issues. So during that roundtable, we're going to talk about podcasts, about story maps, policy briefs, art, and other methods. And this is a topic that's very important to me because when you work with people, which many of us in border studies and in gender studies do, I think it's essential to find ways to make the results of the research accessible for the participants, for organizations that may work or advocate for the people that we're working with for our research, or for government as well, and make those research results available and useful for others. And I think that because both gender studies and border studies topics have become quite political, from the standpoint of someone with a background in political science, I think it's necessary to make sure that results from research that is fact-based on such important topic are not solely shared in academic papers that are not accessible to all, whether because you have to pay for them. Most papers are published in English, so there's a language barrier as well. And it's also quite a commitment to read a 30-page academic paper, we won't lie. So I think that would be quite an interesting space for some scholars to come together and to kind of talk about their initiatives and what have they done and what are the difficulties and challenges, but also what are the rewards of putting the effort into making sure that our research results are presented and shared in ways that is accessible and in various formats, such as a podcast or interactive online tool, to make sure that it's accessible to as many as possible and in various formats. So some people may prefer to read, others may prefer to listen to something. So to kind of be mindful of that and make sure that we do our work as researcher and we make sure that our results are accessible.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andréanne. And to end our discussion of an inspiring note for future generations of researchers, what advice would you give to a young researcher or student interested in gender and border studies, Andrea?
That's such a hard one. I think that if you're interested in gender studies and in border studies, oftentimes it's because you're interested in individuals' experiences or dynamics of power or issues within a specific conflict. So with that in mind, it's quite rare that your object or your topic of research is only positive, right? So there's quite a lot of negative that comes with it. So my advice would be to never lose sight of your why. Why are you doing this research? Why is this topic important? and to never lose sight of yourself either. So how are you impacted by this topic? What can you do to protect yourself while doing field work? And thinking about those ahead of time will help you stay motivated, make you mindful of the difficulties that may come up, the things that you can read, hear, or see, and make sure that you keep your eye on finishing that project, because your project will have an impact. And these questions are very important. And as I mentioned, gender studies and border studies allow to render visible dynamics and issues that have oftentimes stayed invisible. And I think that that work is quite important and deserves to be done and deserves to be heard and read.
Thank you very much, Andréanne Bissonnette, for this conversation about the complex relations between gender studies and border studies. I realized better with our conversation that borders are norms, a melting pot of different norms, of different types of norms. They could be constitutional norms, legal norms, political norms, social norms, cultural norms, etc. And this was a great pleasure to have you today, Andréanne. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me and for making this space for researchers to share their research, their results, and their labor of love with everyone.
Thank you very much, Andréanne. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.